gears. I want to focus on the ripple effect of these future scenarios specifically, but maybe more importantly, how the ripple effect starts to more intensely blur the boundaries across these various industries. And I find that this autonomous vehicle scenario works extremely well to get leaders to see just how broad and deep the impact clearly is. And so one of the things that you have done extremely well in your writing is to kind of make that real for leaders, talk about the various things that the autonomous vehicle will impact and how it does cross industry boundaries. So walk us through some of the industries impacted. Examples would be things like municipal revenue streams drying up because traffic accident or traffic violations don't occur, or parking revenues drying up, those kinds of things that people don't normally think about. So give us an example of some of the breadth and depth of this scenario.
Sure. If we think about autonomous technology, I think there's a break point at, if we think about extreme scenarios, there's a break point at whether or not the car is autonomous, whether or not it requires a driver. That's the extreme case. So if we have totally driverless cars, consider this possibility. Business models today, automotive business models today, are built on individual car ownership. If you did not require a driver in autonomous cars, you could imagine a driverless taxi service that instead of requiring you to buy a car, that came to you in a few minutes' time and took you point to point. You start imagining that people might take Uber-like services instead of owning a car. And there have been financial modeling that says that those kinds of services could actually operate for about 20% the cost of owning a car. So dramatically less costly because you've taken the most expensive element of a car service, the driver, out of the equation. Okay, so let's imagine that scenario. You start having Uber-like car services instead of car ownership. Each year, about $500 billion flow through U.S. car dealers. So if you started having a shift away from individual car ownership to mobility services, that money, that channel gets dramatically impacted. Now, people will still buy cars because services like Uber will still be buying cars, but they'll be buying them as whole fleets as opposed to individually, and they'll be buying them from manufacturers. So here's one technical capability that translates to an enormous business model disruption, $500 billion a year.
Yep, great example. And what about things like less cars on the road, impact to the environment, fuel efficiencies that come from the ability for driverless cars to drag behind one another? The need for infrastructure diminishes because you, again, have less cars on the road. What about those kinds of things? See a lot of that happening as well if this scenario plays out, correct?
Well, here's another interesting statistic. In downtown city centers, some studies find that as much as 30% of the traffic is people driving around looking for parking spots. So if you have a driverless car that drops you off and then drives away by itself, either to park itself at the far away in a cheap lot or just go to the next passenger, you can dramatically reduce the traffic that's going around looking for parking spots. And here's another interesting ripple effect from that. Once you have that, then you start asking yourself, do I need parking garages? More specifically, do I need expensive parking garages downtown? Or even if I need parking garages at all, can I move them further away? And suddenly you start thinking, well, what do you do with all that real estate that's now devoted to cars? In some ways that's good because you can repurpose that real estate for other uses. You might turn them into parks, you might turn them into commercial areas. But then suddenly you also have this massive amount of real estate that's flooding the market, which may have dramatic negative effects. So as you start thinking about these simple, relatively simple technical capabilities you can imagine, the ripple effects on industry is dramatic. Now, one of the things we have to realize is we don't always understand exactly what's going to happen. In the sense that if we make transportation cheaper, by 80%, does that mean we have less cars on the road, or do we have more cars on the road? we certainly have more efficient use of infrastructure if we don't have any more cars on the road, but we may actually have miles traveled go up. Those are kinds of questions that you have to think deeply through if you're in one of those industries where that's a critical issue for you.
And to your point, there's no way of knowing exactly how those scenarios play out. To your point on more cars on the road, the fact that young children that can be driven by a driverless car and the parents not required, or the elderly or disabled start driving again, all those things could actually lead to more cars on the road, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. So those are both challenges and opportunities. They're challenges if you sit in an existing industry that's built upon the current assumptions. So, for example, $80 billion a year in the U.S. is spent on collision and auto repair. Well, that's when you start, having fewer accidents, that's a bad thing. But if you're, in the business where you might profit from more people moving from the driver's seat to the passenger seat, for example, if you sell content or if you're, in commerce, that may be a good thing. So you have to take these developments and follow the trail of effects.
Yep. Well, I think in terms of the objective of that specific question, objective met, because clearly we can see how many different industries, and we just touched the tip of the iceberg here, are impacted, and how broadly and deeply you need to think about these scenarios if you're going to be successful navigating them. Well, fascinating stuff, Chunka. And unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank you for joining us today with those great insights, and look forward to working with you in the future. If you'd like to learn more about Chunka and his perspectives on the future, please visit chunkamui.com. You can learn more about our work at TCS by visiting tcs.com, or additional perspectives from my blog at frankdiana@wordpress.com. Thanks all for joining.